Yeah, so hello everyone, I'm Olli. You will hear soon a little bit more about me. But today I'm going to why I prefer unit tests over UI tests. And it was nice to see that Jussi already talked quite many topics that I'm also touching today. So you already a little bit know about topics and what are UI tests or end-to-end tests and unit tests. And I have to give credit to one of my colleagues, Lassi Autio, who has originally given this presentation in some form. I have a little bit adjusted it, but I can kind of get the idea for the presentation from him. So credits for him also. But yeah, who is Olli? So I have been building software quite a while already. So since 2006 I have been writing professionally code. And mostly I have been working with Java and also JavaScript and TypeScript. And I have been writing automated tests most of my career. And a side note, usually before the actual code. So also fan of TDD. So I can also discuss about that topic if you want. Well, not in this presentation, but after this. But yeah, and as you noticed, I work at Solita. But what we are going to talk today, so some rough and boring definitions about what different type of tests actually mean. Just already covered some of that. Some pros and cons of different kind of tests. And I will introduce you testing pyramid, which kind of helps you decide what kind of tests you should be writing and how much of those. And then we'll have some short summary. And you can ask questions at any point. We will have plenty of time to ask those after the presentation, but feel free to interrupt me and ask questions also during the presentation. But yeah, the boring definitions. So unit tests, isolated tests, testing small part of code. And all the dependencies are mocked out, or kind of there isn't any dependencies if it's kind of just some small function that you are testing. Then integration tests mean that you are combining these smaller units and testing those together, and usually with some real dependencies like database and or like the API tests or whatever is your kind of system. And then end-to-end tests or UI tests that use the real system. There is a system running somewhere and you are running the tests against the real system. And those are usually like mimicking real use cases, like log into the system and like put some item into the basket and buy it and kind of complete workflows instead of just some small part of logic. Yes. So some myths about those UI tests. So I have been hearing that UI tests are better because they test whole software, concentrate on them. So sounds really awesome, like testing the login and the whole workflow. And if we have many UI tests that test already something, no need for other kind of tests. So there's the login, buying something, and kind of lots of different things are already covered in UI tests. So why to bother write some unit tests? Or it's waste of time and money to write unit tests for this feature because there are many UI tests that use this feature in background. So kind of the same as the last one. But yeah, what the UI tests are good for. So as I already mentioned, they test the actual deployed software. And there is a value in that, because if you're just using unit tests and deploy it somewhere, it might be that it's not working. So there are plenty of things that can break while deploying things and kind of combining the whole system together, not just some parts of it, but the whole system together. And usually there are lots of integrations at the background and things like that are also tested with UI tests. And they test the real usage of the product. So not just like, if I put this item in the basket, does the amount of the items in the basket go up? That's a kind of like really small thing, but compared to that, you test the whole workflow, like what's the actual use case, and not just some small part of it. And it can show you what actually has been run. So you can get recording like videos of what actually happened while you were running the test. And that might be really interesting and helpful to see that if something broke, like what went wrong, and if something looked funny while the test was running. But what about the cons? So the tests can be really flaky. There can be lots of false negative results. So kind of tests are failing, but I don't know why, and kind of I run those again. Now it's passing. So is there something broken or isn't there something broken? And that's not so uncommon while working with kind of high-level tests, that there are so many different things that can break. And for example, we saw that kind of picking some element from the UI, and for some reason something is taking a little bit longer. It's not rendered yet while you are asserting that it should be there, and it breaks up. So sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. And also, they are really fragile. So if you change just some small thing, the workflow can break up. And it might be quite hard to notice what's wrong. And it might be that there was a button with buy and then some product name or what was added to that, and test was failing. So it might be quite small thing that makes the whole test fail. Feedback cycle is really slow. So those tests take quite much time to run. So compared to like milliseconds of unit tests, they tend to take seconds or tens of seconds to run one test. And no hint where the problem is when the test breaks. So, we saw the example of getting the 500 response code from the backend, like with no idea what's broken and what's wrong, and we need to kind of dig in and check if it's the database or if it's the validation or if it's something else that got broken. So no clue what is wrong. And because it's kind of like testing longer workflows, all the code paths, so there was mentioning about the white box and black box testing. So if you consider all the kind of if statements and all that, you can't test all of those with UI tests. It just is too much work. And if you want to test error handling, like those bad inputs or anything like that, UI tests are not your best friends for doing that. And here's a snapshot of my current project I'm working on. So this is all the end-to-end tests that we have. And there's plenty of green, but also plenty of red ones. And everything should be working, but the tests are still failing. And I'm not sure if something is broken or not broken. It looks like something is broken, but then it might be that we rerun the tests and then they're green again. So there are some real problems. But what about unit tests then? So pros about those, they are fast to run, and I have a typo there, but no problems. So the feedback cycle is really fast. So as we saw in the previous presentation, so you type something, run the test, and like almost instantly you have the feedback if something is broken or not. And if we think about UI tests, so I mentioned that those usually take seconds or tens of seconds to run. So if there are like 10 or 100 of those tests, you are sitting some minutes idle just waiting to see if something is broken, compared to just like 1 second or 2 seconds with unit tests. They are quite reliable. Of course, you can write bad unit tests that are not reliable, but there shouldn't be false negative results. It should be just the kind of the inputs and what outputs do you get, and that's everything. There shouldn't be any unforeseen problems with the integrations or anything like that happening. So when it works, it works. Easy to spot where the error is. So if the test is failing, usually you're testing some really specific use case or some specific code path or some specific error case. So if the test is broken, you almost instantly know that, it's this line of code, or it's like in these 5 lines of code that where the error is, and it's kind of easy to spot. Cheaper to write compared to UI tests, so usually it's just few lines of code with the tests because the scope is so small, and the UI tests require quite much setup and kind of that kind of things. You can test quite many code paths and have a good test coverage, so covering all the if statements and different branches of code. And also error handling testing is quite easy, so you can use like those bad inputs and see if there is a valid response in you are getting back. And about the last presentation, so there was the validator and you were testing that through the API. I probably would have written tests for the validator and used unit tests for testing the validator. So that would have been faster and also kind of easier to spot what part of the validator is not working. What about cons? Not everything is good with unit tests, so well, you are testing only a small part of code base. So if you want to get idea if these like smaller parts are working together, then that's kind of hard to achieve with the unit tests. Well, obviously it doesn't test the integrations and how well the things work together. So for example, the database or HTTP calls or like AWS or Azure features or whatever you are using. And of course doesn't test the real end user scenarios. So usually the unit tests are quite specific with like some corner cases that are probably not so common in real life scenarios. So about the test coverage, I already mentioned that it's hard to test all the code paths with UI tests. So for example, this code here, there are 8 different ways of going through that. So if you're going to the if branch or not and combining those. And if you would use UI tests to test all of those branches, it would take the 8 UI tests, and if they run for like 9 seconds, total 72 seconds for testing that small part of code. And if you're using unit tests that run in like 10 milliseconds, it's only like 80 milliseconds, so really much faster. And yeah, it's not so uncommon to have lots of different kind of code paths that you're running through, so not only those 8 that this example has. So really cumbersome to test all of those with UI tests. But yeah, unit tests work nicely for that. So, are we happy with unit tests? Probably not. So, there is this, well, 2 nice pictures about unit tests. So, for example, about the chain. So, all the links on the chain are intact. So, unit tests are passing, but the chain itself isn't working very well. So, no integration tests for it. But if you have both kind of tests, all the like specific links are working and also the whole chain is working. And kind of classical example of kitchen design where the unit tests are passing, all the drawers are coming out, but if you try to use those at the same time, not so good idea. Yeah, so that's about the unit tests and UI tests, and I promised to talk something about the test automation pyramids. So there are plenty of different kind of visualizations about those going around in the internet. But the basic idea is that the kind of the width of the pyramid describes how much of those kind of tests you should have in your code base. So having unit tests is kind of biggest portion, little bit less integration tests, and even less end-to-end tests or UI tests. So if you're considering should I write end-to-end tests, integration tests, or unit tests, always start thinking with, can I write this in unit tests, and write some unit tests, and then also on top of that add some integration tests and maybe even end-to-end tests, if that makes sense. And of course, usually some kind of manual testing is also a good idea, more like exploratory testing, so kind of trying to break things in a creative ways. Then there's this anti-pattern of ice cream cone testing, which kind of reverses things. So just few unit tests, more integration tests, lots of automated end-to-end tests, and even more manual regression testing. So please don't do that. It's really, really expensive and not so useful, but consider the testing pyramid instead. So having mostly smaller tests and then only few of those bigger tests. And it's important to notice that also write those integration tests. So I have been mostly talking about the UI or end-to-end tests and unit tests, but those tests in between, so well, Google uses some kind of SML labeling on the tests, and so write also those M-size tests or integration tests or service tests. So they're really important to see if, for example, the database is working correctly with your code, or like the API calls are working correctly. And they are quite reliable usually because there's only some amount of dependencies going around, instead of like the whole system and all the integrations. And they are usually also quite fast to run because it doesn't require that much setup, but of course some setup still. But yeah, so that's basically everything I had to say. So some conclusions. So follow the test automation pyramid. It really helps to focus on the unit tests instead of like the higher level tests. And the unit tests are reliable, fast, know where the bug is, so prefer those. But also remember to write integration tests on top of those, and maybe add some UI tests also, because those also have value. But if you have tons of those UI tests, then things get cumbersome. So that's all I had to say. So thank you. Any questions?